Hello, linguists. Welcome back to Lecture 2B, Our Goofy Language 2. Our Goofy Language 1 was basically a what lecture. It was an analysis of the different kinds of irregularity, primarily in English spelling. This is a why lecture, a how did things get to be that way lecture. There are going to be three parts to it. It turns out the goofiness of English spelling is in fact a historical record. There's a reason for all that irregularity. In fact, there are three reasons we'll go over. First of all, language fossils. When you find, say, a silent letter, it's like digging up an arrowhead or a dinosaur femur. It tells you something about the past of the language. Second of all, irregularities are records of war, empire, trade. They're like the scars of past wars. And third, academic meddling. Cases in which people, I guess, like myself, reach into the language and change it for reasons that appear to be rational to them, though not always to us. First of all, language fossils. Why all of those silent letters? We looked at some of them in the lecture. I asked you to come up with many more examples for the homework. For what rational reason would a word come into the language and have a silent letter, a letter that does no work? I used to joke with my kids when they were young. They would ask me how to spell something like dog when they were young. And I would say to them, D, and they're writing very slowly, O, G, Q, Q, Q. And they'd look up at me. I said, the last three Q's are silent. Well, that's completely silly and irrational. I had fun with it. But no language puts pointless letters into words. Those letters are there. This is one of your big ideas of this lecture, because they used to be pronounced. And there's no better example of that than the Pythons. Oh, Monty Python, still so funny. 1972, I think the movie came out, almost the year of my birth. I hope you're still watching it. Check out the French taunter scene in which the English king, Arthur, arrives at a French castle, and they're in the search for the Holy Grail. And let me just read you a little bit of the exchange they have, because it will illuminate something about current spelling, telling us something about historical pronunciation. Arthur, to the man you see up there, "Go and tell your master that we have been charged by God with a sacred quest. If he will give us food and shelter for the night, he can join us in our quest for the Holy Grail." The guard, "Well, I'll ask him, but I don't think he'll be very keen. He's already got one, you see." "What?" "He says they've already got one." "Are you sure he's got one?" "Oh, yes, it is very nice." And he says to you, I told him we already got one." Arthur, well, can we come and have a look?" "Of course not. You are English types." Arthur, "Well, what are you then?" "I'm French. Why do you think I have this outrageous accent, you silly king?" Galahad asks, "What are you doing in England?" The guard, "Mind your own business." Arthur, "If you will not show us the Grail, we shall take your castle by force." And then the insults start flying. Guard, "You don't frighten us, English pig dogs. Go and boil your bottoms, sons of a silly person. I blow my nose at you, you so-called Arthur King. Get ready, here it comes. You and all your English kniggets." And he draws the word out like that. Kniggets. What's he doing? He's making a comment on the history of the English language and goofy modern irregular English orthography. K-N-I-G-H-T. What's the K doing there? What's the G? What's the H doing there? They're there because in Middle English, that's what M-E stands for, it was pronounced Knecht. Knecht. It's related to a German word today, which is pronounced Knecht. K-N-E-C-H-T. Means fellow or guy or page. So Knigget was the French making fun of English spelling. You see the same thing in German words. Remember that English split off from Germanic, which goes back to Proto-Indo-European, but English split off of German 1500 years ago to become Old English. And so some things which are still spelled one way but not spoken in English are both spelled and spoken that way in German, one of our closest cognate languages. So the German word for 8, which by the way is spelled E-I-G-H-T, oh, those tricky GHs, you never know what they're going to do. The German word for 8 is spelled A-C-H-T, with the CH where the GH is, and it's acht, where there's a guttural right in there. Why is that? Because 8 used to be pronounced with a in the middle, too. If that is an example of history explaining goofy pronunciation, there's also an example of history explaining current goofy grammar. Have you noticed how there's some plurals in English which are not S plurals? 98, I don't know the numbers, 98, 99, nearly 100% of the words in English, nouns in English, form their plural by adding an S. But there's some exceptions. Guess what? Those are also fossils. In front of you, we've gone back from Middle English to Old English now. We're now 1,000+ years in the past. And there are a lot of forms on there. This is actually a sort of declension. It's all the different forms that nouns could have in different kinds of nouns, different classes of nouns. And if you just look at the circled parts, singular and plural, you notice that the different classes of nouns, oh, by the way, do you see how nouns had gender too? Masculine, neuter, feminine? Maybe you thought that only existed in French or Spanish or German or Latin. Guess what? English used to have that too. So there were classes of nouns, and the different classes of nouns had different plurals. So English originally had many plural forms. Stan, meaning stone, it was stanas, and there's your S. That's the one which in the great battle of the English plurals won out and genocided all of the others with only a few exceptions remaining. But notice that sheep, the plural was sheepu. U is a plural. That's essentially completely gone. I don't think there's one of those left. The word luvu, for love, had two plurals, luva or luva, where A or E, a switching of vowels was plural. That I think is also gone. Nama was name, that ended in N, naman, the N plural. Sunu, for son, became suna. And book became bech. Where there's an interior vowel change, that actually changes the pronunciation of that C from a K to a Ch. We'll learn why that would be later. Just like the change of the plural in modern goose, geese, or mouse, mice, man, men. There's an in plural, like nama, naman, in brother, brethren, and also child and children. Why are those irregular? Because they're the holdouts. They're the staunch survivors of these ancient common forms of plural in English. And even up until 1600, Shakespeare's time, Shakespeare could have brethren, but also sustren. In the King James Bible, 1612, you have Pharaoh, and Joseph has that dream. It's Joseph, isn't it, right? The dream of the 7 lean cows for 7 lean years. In the KJV, it's 7 lean kine, because the plural of cow is not cows, it's kine. Internal vowel change, and that in, like nama, naman. So when you see those words, greet them, congratulate them on their staying power. A principle underlying everything that I've been telling you about is the incredible pace at which language sounds, the way we speak and pronounce our words, changed in the pre-modern era. And by pre-modern, in this case, I simply mean in the time before printing and the time before radio and the internet. Because if you can have 2 billion or more people on Facebook in just a couple of languages, that kind of anchors the language in place, keeps it from moving. But in a time when the world was more tribal, more divided up, where people went separate ways and didn't see each other, their language would move on, often so much that grandchildren had trouble understanding their grandparents, literally understanding what words they were saying. Pronunciation changed very quickly. Well, you're very clever to ask for some examples. Here's an example. The great vowel shift. You could call this a very big vowel movement if you wanted to. I don't, but you certainly might. Between about 1300 and 1600, think that's like Chaucer, who died in about 1400 to 1600, Shakespeare, English was undergoing a shift in the sound made by its vowels. So today you look at those green vowels and you say A, E, I, O, U. Now let me ask you, do you speak Spanish? If any Spanish? What are they in Spanish? A, E, O, U. Do you have any German? A, E, O, U. Do you have any Irish? A, E, O, U. Russian? Serbian? A, E, O. Do you sing in a choir? How do you warm up those vowels? A, E, O, U. Those are what I'll call their European values. Well, over those couple of hundred years between our two authors, those vowels were slowly, bit by bit, here and there, changing their sounds from A to A, from A to E, from E to I. O basically stays the same, slight change, and U basically stays the same. For instance, oh, and also, there were no silent vowels in a phonetically written language like Middle English when it got written down. So let's think back to the earlier period, pre-GVS, pre-Great Vowel Shifts. If you're reading Chaucer in Middle English and you see name, you're not going to make the A say A and the E go away. You're going to say, try it, what would it be in Spanish? Something like nama. The next word is not meat. It was mate. Next word is food. Hey, that's rather simple. And the last one is not fine. It's fin. Those are all Middle English. All you've done is used European, think Spanish, vowels, and put them and made sure that there are no silent letters. So, we have a situation in which modern English spelling does not line up with modern English pronunciation. What it lines up with is an earlier state of the pronunciation of our language. Well, why the differential? Why the lack of alignment? Why doesn't our language's writing now reflect our language's pronunciation now? And the reason? It all goes back to one dude, one guy, and that is Mr. Burns. No, wait, wrong slide. Sorry. It's this guy. Check out what he's got there. He's not making apple cider. That's Johannes Gutenberg, a German printer who invented, in the West at least, movable type printing press right around 1450, round numbers. And here's the key. Remember how I said that when you have printing or mass communication, and yes, the printing press counts, that tends to slow and even sometimes stop the evolution or the constant changing of the way you write. So English orthography starts getting anchored to the ground, starts getting stuck in the mud about 1450 with Gutenberg, who basically halts or begins the process of halting the spelling of English. And when is he doing this? That's right at a time when the pronunciation of English vowels is undergoing the Great Vowel Movement. No, wait, I said that wrong. The Great Vowel Shift. In other words, sound marches on, and thanks to Gutenberg, spelling does not. That's the single biggest reason for English goofy spelling. Darn you, Gutenberg! Oh, by the way, see those cases of letters? Those are letters that a printer would take out and put into a rack to press. What kind of letters are up in that top case? Upper case letters. That's just a little tidbit Why do we say uppercase, lowercase? It goes back to the physical technology here, when Gutenberg was busy tying our language to an earlier form of pronunciation. Gutenberg, by the way, has got to be up there on the list of most important people in the history of Western culture. I watched an A&E program once. It was called Most Influential People of the Millennium. I was super interested. And it's one of these countdowns, so they go through like 100. And we're going through all of the great figures. There's Galileo and Luther and Einstein and Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Attila the Hun and William the Conqueror. And we're getting up to the top. And who's going to be number one? Number one, Johannes Gutenberg. Their criteria was who has affected the world more than anyone else. And more than any of those other figures, Gutenberg. Because by creating the printing press, he enabled mass communication for the first time. And that is the foundation on which things like the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, were built, because scientists could share their results. The Reformation, with its emphasis on sola scriptura, having your own Bible, not relying on a priest to tell you what's in the Bible. Well, you have to have a cheap, easily reproducible text for you to own if there's going to be a Reformation, or the technology doesn't support the theology. A couple centuries later, 19th century, universal education. That's a pipe dream unless there's cheap, reproducible texts. As I said, begins the standardization of spelling. He also gives us this new sense of correctness of spelling, an idea that just hadn't existed before then. Spelling was phonetic, it differed from region to region, but the whole idea of what is the right way to spell X, or even what is the right meaning of X, or is X a word, all of that standardization mindset comes out of Gutenberg. And I'll repeat it one more time. Due to Gutenberg, spelling begins to halt, but pronunciation, as it always does, marches on. By the way, good epistemological question. Epistemology is, how do you know what we think we know? How do we know the sounds of language changed? If you're clever, you've been wondering that for a few minutes. The answer is actually this contraption. There's a dig in Sussex, archaeological dig, and they found this early medieval tape recorder. No, I'm pulling your leg. I like to do that if you've not noticed. That's not how we know about ancient pronunciation. Rhymes are how we know about ancient pronunciation. It's one way, at least. For instance, we know that Shakespeare rhymed those words, which today do not rhyme, and so they must have had the same value sounds in Shakespeare's time. And it would have been a strange kind of half schwa diphthong, like knees, gris, grass, and grass. Something roughly like that. He also rhymed serve and carve, probably sarve and carve, and convert and depart. This is also, by the way, how we know that July was pronounced Julie, like the girl's name, until about 100 years ago. Queen Elizabeth would have pronounced, back in Shakespeare's time, work as wark, person as parson, and God as Gad, like egad, Eliza Doolittle. Rhymes tell us how words used to be pronounced. So you've got a good handle on silent letters, indications they used to be pronounced. Plural forms, irregular ones, used to be entire classes of very common plurals. Goofy spelling as a historical nugget dug up of how historical pronunciation sounded. A second reason that our spelling is irregular. It's a history of war, empire, and trade. It's like a scar on the language left by battle and empire and colonization. Think back just about 100 years ago to the height of the British Empire before its dissolution towards World War I. The British Empire controlled about a quarter of the Earth's landmass surface. There's the line, the sun never set on the British Empire. And what did they take to all of these places in addition to guns, germs, and steel? They took the English language. And when the English language went to all of those places outside of Britain, it encountered a lot of new things, customs, and words in indigenous languages. And there's a kind of semi-permeable barrier between English and other languages, such that other words from those languages make their way into English. And very often, English needs a new word for a new thing which it's encountering, whether that's an animal in a climate that doesn't exist in England, or a cultural artifact like a kind of clothing which doesn't exist in England, or just a very commonly used word in one of these new places from, America, North America, all the way to Australia. Examples of new words being added for newly discovered things. America, caribou, moccasin, moose. There are very few moose running around, or muskrats running around Great Britain. Squash, tomahawk, wigwam. Many of those, of course, are indigenous Native American words, and they're brought over, often changed a little bit from what their authentic pronunciation would be. But they also do bring, if it's a written language, the native spellings, or sometimes they have sounds that we just don't have in English. We've got to do our best to represent whatever that sound was using the letters that we do have in English. Examples from India, also colonized by the British. The snake anaconda. Not much bamboo growing in England. Candy, isn't that nice? And of course, a nice curry, a hookah, which you smoke, the mango, tom-tom, yoga. New words, new pronunciations, and along with them, new attempts at spelling combinations. Here's some words and their origins. Kangaroo. And I won't pronounce, but you can see on the screen what the original language form, or if not written, pronunciation likely was. Did you know that muscle came from the Latin for mouse? So when you make a muscle with your biceps, like a little mouse pops into existence right on there. Isn't that a fun sort of metaphor word? And just again showing you can find a picture of anything on the internet. There is a muscle kangaroo. A mouse kangaroo, I guess. That one is especially interesting. Kinky, it's Dutch for a knot and rope. Moccasin. I especially will not attempt to pronounce the Scots word for battle cry or the old Irish word for water or life, because these Celtic languages, their pronunciation of letters has traveled so far from what I'm familiar with that most of them are out on the islands of Great Britain. And when you're out on an island, and even an island off an island like Ireland is, or the very north of an island like Scotland is, you tend to become an outlier. Your pronunciation becomes different from that of other languages. So I have no idea that the word U-I-C-E could be pronounced bibbidi-bop for all I know in Irish. I never try to pronounce Irish. Never studied it. Hope to someday, but as of now, I have no idea how to say it. So when words like this come into the English language, we get spelling patterns that you would not be able to decipher using some of the more common patterns in the English language. It is true that English is a language that lurks in dark alleys, beats up other languages, rifles through their pockets for spare vocabulary. There's a brutality to that, as well as humor, but it's linguistically very true. Speaking of battles, if there's one battle, war, you need to remember, one invasion, and 1 year you need to remember for this class, it's 1066. Go ahead and carve that into the nearest desk or wall near to you, 1066. We just carve it metaphorically on your mind. This is the year when Britain, still run by those German Anglo-Saxons we encountered from the first sentence of English, is taken over by some French, like the guy in the funny hat. And the French, a version of French, the Norman French, more about that when we do Middle English. This, by the way, is what gives us Middle English, 1066. We get a situation where the underclass of conquered Anglo-Saxon Britons, the Germanic peoples, now speak one language. So Old English is being spoken by the underclass, those who've just been conquered. And the ruling class, the overclass, which is a French class, are speaking Norman French. So there are two languages going on in England. And this happens for a couple hundred years. Yes, there are a couple hundred years where England is ruled by French speakers. And that's true for the nobility and the king. It's also true for the higher echelons of the church, the bishops, archbishops, and all the appointments they make. And because of these two languages, we have a kind of duality of vocabulary in our language. We have a very unusual situation. Let's say you want some meat for supper. And if you're back in this historical period around 1066 and you're a peasant, you almost never eat meat. If you're eating meat, you're probably a member of the aristocracy, the ruling, conquering class. But we have the situation in English where if you have a pig in the field, you don't come home to a nice dinner of a slab of pig. No, it becomes pork when it's on the table. Why is that? Well, pig has Germanic roots. Pig is the word that the workers, the serfs, essentially the peasants, would use for the animal because it was their job to take care of the animals while serving their masters, the French. But when that pig gets slaughtered and sliced up, it ends up on a French person's table in England. And the French word for pig is pork. And we have both of those words in English today. It's a kind of goofiness, right? It doesn't just apply to that animal. A cow in the field, do you go to McDonald's and order a triple cow burger? No, it becomes beef. Where does beef come from? Bœuf. It's French. Even a deer in the field, deer actually meant just animal in Old English, becomes venison. You can almost hear the French venison on the table. And finally, an old sheep becomes, do you know this one? We don't eat it much in America, though they do in England. Mutton, mouton, on the table. So another goofiness, a fact that a meat is different from, the word for the food is different from the word from the animal it came from. Not true in other languages, most of them. It's true in English, and it's a historical record. It's a scar on the language, and it points to the suffering and the experiences of people in the Norman conquest of 1066. Third reason for English spelling and usage being goofy. Academic meddling. Yes, I take the fall for this. People like me. Okay. We're going to use the example of the word debt. And if you've been paying attention, you're already thinking ahead of me, and you're saying, okay, debt. It's spelled with D-E-B-T, spelled with a silent B. Where'd the B come from? Aha! I paid attention to number one, so I know it used to be pronounced in English debt. And because of Gutenberg, Mr. Burns, we now say debt, but we used to say debt, and we write debt, and it doesn't match up and all that. Actually, no. This is a different story. We're not in 1066 now, we're in the 18th century. And if you remember, just from whether it's literature class or kind of history class, what's the 18th century known for? Reason. It's the Enlightenment, the age of reason. An age in which intellectuals attempted to take all kinds of human experiences and reduce them to logical principles. It's also an age where educated people knew Latin and Greek. And they idealized these ancient languages, Latin and Greek. Classical antiquity, right? Like the Renaissance. And we have a situation where people were trying, they'd noticed this irregularity in English spelling, and they were trying to fix it. People who were basically English professors, basically professors of language, though they weren't really English professors yet. They were trying to correct English because they noticed the problem. It doesn't line up with rational principles. And if you add together their desire for sort of logical systems that make rational sense and their love of ancient languages, they reasoned the following way. If you go back to Latin, the word for debt, an obligation, is debitum. That's in Latin, where it does have a B. And they said, well, we can fix this by putting a B into the language to make it more regular. The problem is, from our perspective, English had never said debit. It had always said debt. In fact, English had borrowed the word debt from the French. Remember, the French sort of is late Latin. And the French word for debt was debt. So in English and in French, there had been no B. You had to go back to the Roman Empire, practically, 2,000 years ago, to find a B in that word. But the grammarians changed it from debt to debt in spelling, not as a record of historical English spelling, but as a desire to correct or fix the language by making English emulate Latin. They just reached in, changed it, and say we do this because it is good and true and correct because it's like Latin. So you can thank people who basically had my job in the 18th century for some English spelling irregularities like that. B, a sign of academic meddling, not of historical pronunciation.